Good evening, everybody. Hello and welcome to this week's RCS Exchange Talk. Thank you for joining us. My name is Oliver Searle. I am the interim head of composition here at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, and I will be chairing this evening's talk and introducing Dr Lucy Hollingworth in just a second. So just a couple of short housekeeping things first of all, and a quick introduction. So first of all, tonight's BSL interpreter is Yvonne Strain. Thank you, Yvonne, for joining us. Yvonne's video will be visible throughout the talk, and during presentations they'll be shown on the right-hand side of the screen. So you can scale that screen up by hovering over the video and using the arrow. Subtitles can be accessed via the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And once you've clicked on the CC button, you can choose to view this as subtitles or as a full transcription on the right-hand side of your screen. Tonight's talk will be followed by a question and answer session that will last approximately 15 minutes. If you'd like to ask a question, then please put these in the Q&A function, which again, you can find at the bottom of the screen. You can vote up questions for Lucy that you find particularly interesting, and I will do my best to get through as many as possible. So for the duration of this webinar, participants' cameras and microphones will be turned off. And if you would like to tweet about tonight's event, please do so to the Twitter handle, which is @RCS_the-exchange. A full list of our upcoming exchange talks can be found in the link that will be put in the chat too. And I'd just like to say a couple of words to introduce Lucy. So Dr Lucy Hollingworth is a composer, musicologist and writer based in Scotland. She writes instrumental music for soloists and ensembles with a particular interest in the string quartet as a genre. She has had recent commissions from Sound Scotland and Glasgow New Music Expedition, and has also created large-scale work for music and the spoken word. Her research interests include women composers, autoethnography, and analysis. And as a creative writer, she writes poetry and life story. Her PhD was a feminist creative autobiography. She teaches at the Open University and also here at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. So welcome, Lucy. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm going to hand over you now to make your presentation.
Thank you, Oliver. I'll just share my screen. In 2020, the thing I had dreamed of but had thought could never happen came to pass. At approaching 60 years of age, I became a doctor of music. When I embarked on the PhD in 2013, I had no idea that it would change or be changed so profoundly due to the events that were about to befall me. The PhD that I had planned and the PhD I produced are not the same. But maybe I'm wrong there, because the PhD I proposed was about life story and about human experience, and that is exactly what I finally submitted. In this presentation, I am going to talk about a work that I wrote right at the start of this process and one from the end 6 years later. I'll describe some of the creative decisions that I made and why, and how they communicate my experiences to my audience, both as autobiographical and as autoethnographic art. This is me at age 18 years. I was about to go to university to study for a bachelor's degree in music. Since I was a young child, I had dreamed of wonderful music making and an academic career. And heading off to Manchester University in 1979 set me on the right road. I successfully completed my bachelor's degree despite some challenging personal difficulties along the way, and looked forward to taking a master's degree in composition. But life does not always go as planned. Whilst at university in the early 1980s, I entered into a long-term relationship and later married. But this relationship was problematic and resulted in me giving up my career as a composer and in music completely. And I remained in that difficult place for over 20 years. In 2005, my brother died at the age of 49. And it was this loss that shook me into looking at my own life and asking why I had given up the thing that I most loved, my music. This was the catalyst that led me to leaving my first husband. I found a new partner, Keith, who is everything that my first husband had not been. He was supportive, encouraging, and believed that I could and should recover my lost life as a composer. It was because of this extraordinary man that I went in 2010 to Edinburgh University to study for a master's degree in composition, and from there to the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland for my PhD. I began my PhD studies in the autumn of 2013. Keith had been poorly over the summer with a suspected heart problem. But in December, a scan diagnosed an incurable cancer. We were advised that he had only months left. We married in the following March. Keith was placed in the care of a palliative care doctor. I did no further work towards my PhD for a long time. He died in July 2014. I felt a sense of liberation after he had gone because his suffering was at an end, but also a deep emptiness. At that moment, I had no idea how I could continue to live and work without him. After his death, I had to deal with many things, not least a complete house move, as I could not remain in the house where we had been living. For a while, I felt I would never write any music again, but Keith's voice of encouragement remained at work in my mind and in my imagination. And after almost a year, I returned to my PhD studies and started writing again. I found some solace in the return to composition. I had started writing a piano piece in March 2014, a few days before Keith and I married. I only wrote about 30 seconds of music. I played it to Keith and he said the problem with it was that there was not enough. In September of the same year, soon after my return to Glasgow, after Keith died, I wrote a descending melody at the piano and started finding some counterpoints to it. I wrote the words, "I am lonely, Keith," on the manuscript paper. I showed the work to my supervisor and also the music from the previous march. I explained that I felt they were parts of one piece and that it was about the whole experience the previous year. I began working on material with some energy again towards the end of the year and completed it quite quickly. Feelings flowed out of me onto the paper and a piece, "What the Living Do for Solo Piano," came into being. The work reflects my experience as I felt it at the time and takes the listener on a journey through a challenging but universal human predicament. The motif of 4 falling notes, which came to me as a complete idea, suggested the passacaglia form immediately. I called it the lonely melody. The use of passacaglia in art music seems to have its origins in the 17th century, and Silbiger describes the general characteristics of the form in the works of Frescobaldi, whose work influenced the following generation of composers in Europe, as being a set of variations with a triple beat, successive cycles, each with a falling bass line over a tetrachord interval, a stress on the second beat, which momentarily restrains forward motion, and a gentle rocking feeling, perhaps with a touch of melancholy. I didn't consciously write my own ideas with these characteristics in mind, but the powerful cultural associations that I have imbibed as part of my musical education were almost certainly at work in my unconscious decisions. This subject of our cultural associations is something I will return to. The first part of my piece is built upon the descending melody and an associated counterpoint, sometimes interrupted by violent chords, but always with the passacaglia structure remaining intact. This passacaglia melody is symbolic of something relentless that cannot be avoided. There are so many things that must be done when a person dies, and your feelings seem almost incidental. But all the while your heart is breaking day after day. This first musical extract starts very quietly. The counterpoint to the descending melody acquires a life of its own, and it develops its own momentum, only for the grief to re-emerge as an internal voice among the contrapuntal lines, which I've marked here with an arrow. In her performance, the pianist Sinead Lee magnificently emphasizes the return of this line in the body of the sound, and she finds the balance of grief, beauty, and daily existence that I had hoped for in writing this music. The second part is initially much more broken, rather like the fragmented counterpoint to the descending melody at the start of the piece. This is the music I was writing while Keith was still alive. Initially, I had had in mind something energetic and dance-like, but after all the trauma, I found it becoming frantic and reaching an anxious peak, after which it seemed exhausted. It speaks of the hassle, banks, solicitors, phone calls, letters, the move and its accompanying sense of loss as I left the home we had shared, and the attempts to pick up some of the pieces of my PhD and move on. The harmonic structure of the passacaglia returns towards the end. It softens to a whisper, and whilst the shape of the falling melody is still there, it is barely perceptible. In this piece, I was trying to let something out, both about the loss and my feelings of anger at having found and lost someone so special, and the gift of a chance to start again that he had given me, which remained with me. It describes not only the grief and the many things that one must deal with, but also the fact that one is still alive and somehow moving forward, and how one eventually stops crying. I have already touched on the idea of meaning in a passacaglia, and reflecting on this piece, I became interested in my own use of the form. As a form, it has associations for me built up during my musical education. I can think of a number of examples where passacaglia is used to powerful emotional effect. Dido's Lament by Purcell and the Crucifixus from Bach's Mass in B minor come to mind. But I would like to connect my work with two pieces from nearer my own time, and with particular personal stories underlying them too. Rebecca Clark's Passacaglia on an Old English Tune for viola and piano was written in 1941. The piece uses a language much more direct and diatonic than her other well-known works. The theme is often embedded within independent contrapuntal passages, much as I used my theme. Clark wrote the piece whilst she was in the United States, unable to return to London and her friends because of the outbreak of war. Leanne Curtis speculates that the work was written as a memorial to her close friend, Frank Bridge, who died the same year, and may have been intended for a memorial concert for Bridge organised by Benjamin Britten, although it was not ultimately included in this concert. Curtis says, "The Passacaglia emphasizes both her sense of longing and a determined hope, a spiritual transcendence à la Vaughan Williams in her most emphatically British musical statement. Here is a Passacaglia which is an outpouring of passion, taking its listener on a journey through identity, loss, and hope." The other intensely personal Passacaglia that I connect with is the final movement of Benjamin Britten's third string quartet of 1975, La Serenissima, in which solo passages quote 5 themes from his opera Death in Venice and are followed by a Passacaglia. He had used Passacaglia frequently in his work, in particular in opera, to intensify a turning point in a story, as he did in Peter Grimes, where the Passacaglia marks the moment when Grimes's situation passes beyond redeemable. Britten was very poorly when he wrote the quartet, and he was aware that he had very little time left. In this final phase of his compositional output, as David Matthews tells us, the act of composition was an intensely personal one, akin to autobiography. The opera's protagonist, Aschenbach, falls in love with a beautiful young man in Venice. He hopes for a resolution of his conflicted feelings through love, but finds it in death. The opera ultimately ends on a resolved harmony. In the quartet, the same process is left less certain. Carpenter tells us that Britten said, "I wanted the work to end with a question." Britten too embeds his theme within different layers of the texture, as here. This Passacaglia too takes the listener on a personal journey that tells the story of human emotion and frailty without answering the final question. Britten did not live to hear the premiere. In these examples, the passacaglia is used to tell a personal story deeply felt, and we might hope that our listeners will feel and share these same meanings and understand our music through this shared interpretation. And so by using the passacaglia form to tell my listener how it felt for me when I lost Keith, I am sharing something about our shared suffering and its release. What the Living Do was the first work I wrote in my PhD portfolio. It was followed by The Poetess, a musical theatre work that investigates coercive control and childhood trauma. A string quartet, Out of the Snowstorm and Owl, a work about transformation and turning a life around. Mycorrhizal Ecology for two pianos, which imagines the world of two seemingly unrelated lives, which become interdependent. Let Me Speak for clarinet, about finding oneself unable to express one's feelings. And I Lay Down by the Riverside and Dreamed for large ensemble, which is a work about person and place, which I will enlarge upon now. Life with Keith changed everything for me. It was his support and encouragement that led me to return to my lost career as a musician and a composer, and I am in no doubt that he became my muse. The idea of man as muse to a woman has been problematic in the past. Muses are understood in art history as goddesses, upon whom poets and later other artists, philosophers, and intellectuals generally depend for their ability to create their works. Germaine Greer wrote, "The muse in her purest aspect is the feminine part of the male artist, with which he must have intercourse if he is to bring into being a new work. She is the anima to his animus, the yin to his yang, except that in a reversal of gender roles, she penetrates or inspires him, and he gestates and brings forth from the womb of the mind." Greer describes the muse as necessarily the feminine aspect, as does Graves in The White Goddess, when he declares that woman is not a poet, she is either a muse or she is nothing. The poet Claire Pollard, in The Female Poet and the Male Muse, writes, "Why is it so preposterous for us to find inspiration in the men we love? Why are we not allowed to find nourishment in male beauty, as we do in the beauty of the world?" Rather than seeing the male muse as problematic, Pollard argues that perhaps the female poet male muse dynamic is so rare because it both feminizes the man and makes the woman the active partner. And she suggests that modern female poets are reimagining the role for modern times in a poetry that embraces men as our equals and partners, and is capable of both acknowledging and enjoying our own desires. Keith had survived an industrial disaster and saved lives. He was a man passionate about the environment and had been instrumental in the reintroduction of red kites in County Durham. He was an athlete, a competitive masters swimmer who held a UK record. He trained 3 times a week and was both powerful and beautiful in a way that was not in any way feminine. But for me, it was in every way beautiful. It was not just his passion for our environment and his sense of gender justice that made him an object of inspiration for me. There was a stream running through the garden where I lived with Keith in the North Pennines in Northumberland. One morning he told me how he had gone to sleep listening to the sounds of the water and dreamed a piece of music about a river as an endlessly evolving melody. It rose on the moors and flowed down through pools, rapids and falls, under bridges, over weirs, past the remains of a medieval abbey, into a huge reservoir, and out again hundreds of feet below. It hurtled down a steep gorge flanked by ancient oaks, meandered slowly through pastureland and parkland and by the ruins of mills and forges. Finally, it slowly entered mudflats and lost its identity, where it joined a greater body of water heading for the sea. He imagined an orchestra playing all this fast, slow, grand, and delicate music. He asked me, could you write it? How I wish it had been possible to complete I Lay Down by the Riverside and Dreamed and arranged for its premiere before Keith died, but it was not to be. The piece did eventually find its way out of my head onto paper, though, and a commission from the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland made it possible for it to reach an audience. For me, the piece follows a specific river on a specific journey, and every bar of it represents a place that Keith took me to see, to share his love and his enthusiasm for these places with me, and often to show me some very specific plant or ancient site. We searched for a fungus called bog beacon, and he took me to see a secret site of the rare pyrola minor, misnamed as the common wintergreen. We stood for hours on a moorland watching for a ring ouzel, and on a bridge in a gorge watching for a kingfisher. We had a regular stopping point on a car journey home, where we might see red kites, curlews, and lapwings, and another where there was a spotted flycatcher nesting. There was a bird hide by the reservoir where, at certain times of the year, we saw an osprey across the water, and in the same place at night the stars were as clear as I have ever seen them. There were ruins to explore, not just for their interesting natural histories, but also for their intriguing shafts, beams, and water wheels in various stages of decay. Keith was interested in every aspect of this environment, what lived there and grew there, and how it had contributed to the history of the area. And so for me, the piece is about a very specific person's life and character. Counterpoint is everything in this piece. It opens with a piping, repetitive oboe melody and a slowly paced simple pattern on the double bass. I envisaged the place on the bleak and windy moorland where the river rises, and the voices can be heard of the wading birds that go there in the summer to breed. Voices are added in canon to both parts, slowly building up a greater body of contrapuntal sound. Canonic writing has a history in art music which goes back at least to the 13th century. Canon, meaning a rule, is music in which each part has the same line, but the parts start at different times. Think of what we call a round in children's games, and you are thinking of a canon. In the opening of I Lay Down by the Riverside and Dreamed, I actually use a double canon. There are two ideas here, which each grow canonically as the texture thickens. Later in the piece, after the music has been through a number of transformations, depicting the rapids, the reservoir, and the gorge, the canonic opening comes around again, this time reimagined as a single canon for the new environment of the slower moving waters, mills, and water wheels, or at least their remnants in the landscape. The interplay of the instruments depicts the patterns on the surface of the water, and the sudden points of lift where the rhythms and pitches coincide in the working through of the canon are reminiscent both of the eddies in the water suddenly coalescing into faster flow and of traditional musicians playing in unisons and octaves. The final canonic passages of the piece come towards the end, where the river widens and meets the incoming tide, resulting in broad saline mudflats. Lower pitched instruments grind out a passage with a major-minor false relation sound, with the canonic patterning concealed by the way the parts overlap. This is a mixed canon because there are other parts heard which are not taking part in the canon. A chorale played in the first instance by the higher strings. In the muddying of the water, the clarity of the process is also muddied. Historically, canons have been understood as games. Catches is a word associated with them, as one part chases the next. I think of pieces from early music like the joyful 13th century Summer is a Comin' In, and the technical masterpieces like the 9 canons in Bach's Goldberg Variations, in which, in each successive canon, the voices enter at wider intervals apart. So for me, the canon is a playful idea and a device that gives pleasure for its own intrinsic process. Canon is about the relationship of the parts and can be used as a metaphor for human relationship And so now I will briefly focus on two works in which the canon is used in this way. Cesar Franck's Sonata in A major for violin and piano was written in 1886 for the marriage of his friend, the violinist Eugénie Zaï and Louise Bordeaux. Unable to go himself to their wedding, Franck sent the sonata as a wedding gift, and Zaï performed it from sight at the reception with the pianist Leontine Borde-Pen, who was a guest at the wedding. The finale of this sonata is a simple canon in which the two voices follow one another in a truly inspired representation of sharing. In thanking Franck for this music, Zaï said, "Whenever I play this work, I shall be thinking of this happy day, and the art and the affection which Franck has put into this music will spread its glow over our family life." Elizabeth McConkey wrote her fifth string quartet in 1948, soon after the birth of her second child. In these post-war years, she felt very isolated raising a young family without being able to access support from her family, and she went through a period of deep self-criticism as a composer. At this time and throughout her life, she kept up a regular correspondence with her composer friend, Grace Williams, who encouraged her to keep working through these difficulties. McConkey and Williams shared snippets of music with these letters, and McConkey quotes Williams's C sketches in the quartet. It opens with an intense canon which builds and opens into a joyful allegro. McConkey wrote that the canon influences the character of the whole work, and its opening motif and much of the subsequent work is clearly inspired by the sound of C sketches. Triana Matthias says of this work, "This intriguing correspondence suggests that the deep friendship enjoyed by these two composers could find expression perhaps most intimately in purely musical forms." As with my passacaglia examples, these works show the canon being used for deeply felt expression. In these examples, it is friendship and love that is coded into the canonic sharing of material across the instruments. Oliver Sacks wrote, "We humans are a musical species no less than a linguistic one. This takes many different forms. All of us, with very few exceptions, can perceive music, perceive tones, timbre, pitch intervals, melodic contours, harmony, and perhaps most elementally rhythm. We integrate all of these and construct music in our minds using many different parts of the brain. And to this largely unconscious structural appreciation of music is added an often intense and profound emotional reaction to music. By looking at just a few examples of the use of passacaglia and canon, I hope I have engaged you with the idea that our experience of musical forms can take on personal meanings, and these can become deeply embedded in the way we understand those forms, and hence as composers, the way we make choices, consciously or unconsciously, about what musical form conveys. In these examples, form is used to convey personal story deeply felt, and we might hope that our listeners will feel and share these same meanings and understand our music through this shared interpretation. My PhD was an exploration of my own experiences directly and indirectly through the works in the portfolio. It grieves, it searches for answers, and it honors transformational friendship and the Muse. But it was also an exploration of common human experience using a recognizable musical language. I think of this work both autobiographically and autoethnographically. As well as my own life, it touches on society, our values, and our shared interpretations. And in working through my PhD whilst coming to terms with an intense loss, I discovered my own connections with others and how powerfully musical works can convey those connections. Musicologist Chris Wiley has written, "What I'd really like to see is a musical work with no reference beyond the music itself, that is nonetheless interpretable as autoethnography. For example, a purely instrumental piece. Who could say what that really means?" This is a huge question. I do not believe we approach music in the abstract when we listen. We always bring our own reference to our listening, and a purely instrumental piece quickly takes on meanings for the listener as its language unfolds. Wiley goes on to say, for music or any creative artwork to be successful as autoethnography, there would need to be some means of satisfactorily articulating the relationship between the individual and their culture, such that it is accurately communicated to the reader. I offer to you the suggestion that one such means of articulating this relationship could lie in our common understanding of the interpretation of a musical form, and that the composer chooses in order to express the personal in the context of wider human experience. My life changed completely during the 6 years of my PhD, and my research turned its focus on how to tell a story, how to communicate something that is a shared experience but seems impossible to express, and how musical form and process become tools for communication. It became a process of trusting what I know, responding to the music already within me, the shared culture, and the shared humanity. Well, thank you for listening, and please ask questions.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Thank you for that. We have a few questions, one or two here for you. So, question from Sonia Alori. Congratulations on your PhD. I'm keen to know what and where your next musical work will take you. Are you seeking to continue within current fields and Muse, or something else or other?
So the next two musical works which I'm working on at the minute are both connected with poetry, and they're connected with other people's personal experiences. So I'm writing a piece, at the moment I'm writing a piece for violin solo, which responds to a poetry anthology by a young poet, and I'm also in the process of setting works by a Northumbrian poet to music, and hopefully pandemic and current situation allowing, these things will eventually find their way into the concert hall in one form or another.
Thank you, Lucy. Are there any other questions from Lucy at this time? We have one available. I was going to ask, actually, if I may, just while we have the opportunity, are you planning on continuing with some of this work at the moment? Are there works there, do you think you'd like to continue in some way or build on, or are they all completely self-contained and finished as they are, do you think? Is there anything that you'd like to kind of replicate in terms of the passacaglia, for example? Would you like to recreate that or continue with a similar form?
That's an interesting question. These forms infuse everything. I've used them throughout my creative life, and certainly will continue to use them. As far as the works in my PhD portfolio go, the biggest project that I have in relation to that is the Poetess, which was the music theatre work, was performed by students at the Conservatoire. Fabulous performance in 2016. But I'd like to get that to a wider audience because it's got important messages, social messages and personal messages. So that's something that I'm working on at the minute. String quartet, I'll definitely, there'll be more string quartets, and yes, there will be more passacaglias for sure.
Thank you, Lucy. We have a question here from Sandy Coffin. How do the personal experiences with form of the performer-interpreter of a composition impact the way the audience perceives the piece?
That's quite a challenging question, isn't it? I think performers, interpretation is a lot of this. Performers bring this out. So an interesting part of the process of these performances, the two performances that I've presented today, was that I had the opportunity to speak to the performers, and they heard parts of this story, and they were clearly responding. Sinead Lee was definitely responding to a pre-concert chat we had where I took her some photographs and talked about Keith and talked about those things that happened to me, and she was her response and her performance is hugely sympathetic to that, and the form, the way that what I call the lonely melody, the way she wove it in. I mean, I wove it in obviously as a composer, but she wove it in as a creator in a beautiful way. Glasgow New Music Expedition, in a different way, they were guided by the musical director, and they were interpreting as a larger group, so they were in a completely different place. But I think they brought a beautiful compassion and understanding to the use of the canon as a communication and as a sharing process. I could see when they were playing how they were listening and working together in quite an intense way. I'm not sure how much of that we can attribute to them knowing my stories. I suspect that they would have given that under any circumstances. I'm not sure if I've answered that question. To the questioner, try again if I didn't quite get to the point of that question.
Thank you, Lucy. Question here from Simon Vanderveld. Does the listener or audience member need to know what a passacaglia or canon is in order to appreciate the piece properly?
I don't think so. But part of what I'm saying is that in this world, in this culture, we all know these sounds. We recognize, even if we don't know what it's called, and even if we can't place it in some historical context, we're so familiar with these things. Music is everywhere, and I mean the canon as a children's game is something that we learn early on. Passacaglia, I mean, these things crop up if you've listened to. I mean, Bach's B minor Mass is a case in point. So many people are familiar with these works, passively or actively, because these things are everywhere in our culture and society. I think if you translated them to another place and to another culture, then you're looking at a different story there. But the relationship, the way the brain that's why I put in the Oliver Sacks quote. I'm interested in the way that the brain picks up and understands something and then tries to interpret what it hears. So I think perhaps there's potentially a more general understanding for any listener that here are patterns and here are relationships.
Thank you, Lucy. We have another question from Erin Thompson. You mentioned many aspects of art, muses, poetry, and very wide repertoire, as well as landscapes, nature, and specifically moments embracing this. Is this a large source of your influence and inspiration alongside your personal experiences?
Absolutely, it absolutely is. I write poetry. I write creative prose. I draw and paint, although I'm not brilliant. But I engage with that, and I love culture of all kinds, art, theatre, architecture. These things excite me, and I do connect everything with my creative work as a musician. I think I see parallels across all of these forms, shapes, and patterns. So yes, my whole sort of cultural background it widely influences everything that I do. I don't see how it can't. It's the things that are inside me. The things that are inside me are turned in some way, are turned into music and recreated in that form.
Thank you, Lucy. Abby Watson has a question here. You spoke about how your autoethnographic work is connected to your own story, in particular your experience of grief and coercive control. When working with such emotionally rooted life material, what strategies, approaches did you take to take care of yourself, or would recommend to others working creatively with their own traumatic experiences?
That's such a good question, Abby. Thank you for that. Yes, this is very important, and some of it I fictionalized. So when I was writing about coercive control, it's fiction, but it's fiction grounded in real life. It's important to say as well that I've had an awful lot of support. After Keith died, I took bereavement therapy, and I spent a number of years talking to a therapist. And this has been a really important part of this process. I also had phenomenal support from my supervisors, who were very sensitive. Obviously, this happened after I'd started my PhD. This huge loss of Keith just came out of the blue, really, after I'd started my PhD, and everything happened so quickly. The support that I got from the Conservatoire really made a huge difference. There was a point, I think, when I might not have continued and finished the PhD, and it was people at the Conservatoire that made the difference. That was their compassion and their care, and I was I accepted that. I was open to what I heard and to what I was told and to the advice I was given about when to come, for example, when to come back to Conservatoire, when to work and when not to work. I was given the option of taking plenty of time. I was given the option of an extra year at one point. It was mentioned that if I needed an extra year that for my PhD, that wouldn't be a problem. So there was lots of background support there. But you do feel unreal for quite a while, and it's self-care is such an important part of this process. You open yourself up, you reveal yourself through what you do, and I'm doing it now through this kind of presentation. But I'm also conscious of the fact that whilst these are universal and shared emotions, they're also very private ones for me, and I have other places to go to take the grief and the pain, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. There's a question here from Isidore Tenhoven. about working processes. So asking, is or was there a pattern you discovered which distinguished moments of being able to express your grief in creating and moments when grief was blocking your creativity instead? And if so, how did you recognize that, especially with the creative moments?
I found what I found really after I returned to Glasgow was that it was work that opened up creativity. So it was actually sitting down and saying, I don't think I can write anything. However, I'm going to sit down and try and write something, which again came from responsive care I got from people at the Conservatoire who were saying, yes, try something, go away and try something, try and perhaps take this idea somewhere. So when I took these snippets of piano music to my supervisor, he was encouraging me to take small steps and to do a little bit. You know, give yourself 2 or 3 weeks and see if you can write a little bit more of this. And it was that slow and gradual process of work daily and weekly and monthly that actually allowed release of these things. So in writing What the Living Do, I just sat down. Sometimes I sat down and stared at the piano and thought, I don't know where this creativity is going to come from. But because I felt, okay, there's somebody out there and I've said I'm going to do this work, so I'm going to do it. And I tried. Things happened. It's the daily discipline, I think, that made this possible through this process.
Thank you so much for that, Lucy. We've reached the end of our session just now, so I'd just like to say thank you once more again to Lucy, and thank you very much for everyone joining us. Thanks very much also to our BSL interpreter and closed captioner Yvonne Strain and Eilish Murray too. And thank you to Research and Knowledge Exchange team for organising this term's events. Please do follow us on Twitter at RCS_the Exchange. And a link to the full schedule of Exchange talks this term has been posted in the chat. So just to say, next week's talk will be the reactioning of Black performance presented by Ashanti Harris and Sabrina Henry. And thanks again to you all for tuning in. Thank you, Lucy. This concludes this week's Exchange talk, and look forward to having you all join us again next week. Thank you. Goodbye.